Good morning.
Yes, there
Good
are.
morning. Would
there
everyone
are.
take their seat? We're going to begin, please. Good morning. We're going to convene the Budget and Finance Committee. It's 9 o'clock on September the 13th. My name is Dick Rhodes. I am the chairman of the Budget and Finance Committee. It's my first year on the board, and I am the treasurer for the meeting. We'll begin we've established a quorum. We have a quorum, so we have the authority to move forward. I'd like to get approval for the minutes of May the 17th, 2022. Does anyone have any questions or? Okay, do we hear consensus on approval of the minutes?
Yep.
So approved. Oh, I should mention that we have two of our committee members that are absent, but they are excused. Christine Novello is a new member, and Gary Bosak is a returning member. I believe Gary is online. Are you there by chance, Gary? Oh, thank you, Christine. I didn't know.
No, that's about right. For the first hour.
Thank you.
It looks like Gary is still connected.
All right.
Technical issues.
All right. So, believe it or not, we have technical issues with that. Okay. I want to talk about the microphone usage, and this is for our committee members. There's a little button up here. If you push that and speak directly into the microphone, and then when you've completed, you hit the button to turn it off. Okay, you don't want to leave it on, take my word for it. And so I would like to introduce our committee. We have online right now is Christine Novello. Christine has an MBA from Wharton. She's experienced in managerial and executive consulting. She remains active with some select clients. She loves pickleball. And one other note that's interesting, she sings with several musical groups in the area. So welcome, Christine. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Christine?
I also play golf.
Oh, you also play golf.
Really happy to be mostly retired and really excited to join the team and
Thank you, Christine. Next is Frank Bagnato. Frank was born and raised in New York City. He attended NYU, and he studied economics and accounting. He's got a wide range of business experience, everything from working on Wall Street to CEO of a construction firm. He lives in Sun City West. Just kind of editorially, I think I really understood Frank when I saw his email address. Nuts for golf in Sun City West. Do I need to add more, Frank?
I think that more than a few people recognize my name. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to finally come out and serve the committee. A number of people have asked over the years, why don't you serve? Why don't you serve? And the answer was because I've been busy running a mobile notary business for the past 6 years, and I've now decided that that's the end. I'm retired. So thank you for all for coming here today.
Thank you. David Miller. David has a PhD in chemistry. He began his career as a research chemist, and he advanced to senior and executive level positions along the way. He has extensive experience in finance and budget and planning, capital improvement, and organizational overhead. David, would you like to add anything else?
I'd like to thank the committee for giving me the opportunity. Yeah, I want to
Bring the microphone up to your mouth, please.
I'd like to thank the committee for giving me the opportunity to serve. As I was telling Pete, when I retired, I took 5 years off for myself, and my 5 years are now up. So it's time to go back to service again. So thanks.
Next is John Hobald. John is a returning member of the Budget and Finance Committee. He spent much of his career as an economist. He holds a CPA certificate. He's active in chartered clubs and currently holds and has held other positions in chartered clubs, including president and board members. John?
Nothing to add.
Thank you. Susan Redmond. Susan is a CPA. She's an experienced financial manager and she's held positions such as CFO and has sat on several companies' board of directors. She's active in the Sun City West community and has served as senior board officer with multiple chartered clubs. Susan?
Yes, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to serve on this board, and also add that coming from the East Coast, I consider myself very fortunate that I found such a wonderful place called Sun City West. I'd been coming here for like 20 years and never knew it existed, and found out quite by accident after I retired that such a community existed. And again, I'm very honored that you're giving me the opportunity to serve on this board, and I'd like to thank you.
Next is Ann Brown. Ann is to my left. Ann is a returning board member. She's also the vice president of the governing board. She holds a master's in healthcare administration and has extensive experience in healthcare finance. And by the way, she is a dyed-in-the-wool Chiefs fan. Anything?
No.
I think she said go Chiefs. And last is Gary Bosak. I held him for last, hoping that maybe he was able to get on the audio part of this. Gary's a returning Budget and Finance Committee member. He's lived in Sun City West for 21 years. He has served on several committees, including our Golf and Long Range Planning Committee. Gary is a self-admitted fiscal conservative and believes in supporting the investment of maintaining the quality of life that we expect in Sun City West. Okay. Thank you very much. You have met our committee members. Next is item 3.03, committee roster handouts. We've got them, I think, early done.
The key, I think, Dick, is that they're confidential and not for public distribution.
Thank you. Okay. Item 3.04 is using BoardDocs and accessing YouTube. We're going to have an abbreviated section on that, if we could, Karen.
We can. I won't do a deep dive at all. I'm Karen Rupkin. I'm the governing board admin. For those of you who don't know, I help with the committees and act as standing committee secretary these days. Every year at this time, we do a little quick cursory overview of how to get to BoardDocs, which is a governance system that houses our agendas and our minutes. So you go to, as Dave in the back of the room here has brought up our Google search engine, and up in the browser bar, he's already typing in gb.suncitywest.com. That's a little cheat link that once you hit enter, after typing that in, up comes BoardDocs. So it's very quick and easy. It's what everybody can use. I suggest bookmarking the page as well. Anyway, you can see the meetings listed in the middle. And if we, right there are this afternoon's meeting, Sports Pavilion, but if we cursor up to the Budget and Finance Committee, you can double click on that, please. That's how I get to the meetings. Up comes the meeting that you've double clicked on. And if you see two icons that Dave is pointing to at the bottom, view the agenda is how you look at it, and most importantly, to the right, that's how the agenda is printed. So if we just take a quick peek at the agenda, just so everybody knows, you have to click on that, and it's at the left side of the screen. I've had a lot of people ask me that where's the agenda? It's on the left side of the screen. It's not in the middle. Each item of the agenda will come up in the middle. And the last thing I'm going to point out, and Dave's already pointing to it, for example, my part here, I've given the committee a handout, but let's go down one to the next section, Dave, to the next line item. See those little file folders? So you click on any one of them, that means there's an attachment to the line item. And so what's coming are several BNF presentations, and there they are, and you can click on any of them and view them in advance. This is how the committee actually prepares for meetings, by looking at all of these attachments on BoardDocs. So that's all I'm going to go into. Dick, if you're good with that, do you want me to go through YouTube or not?
I think we're good.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Pete Finelli is going to present a report on financial and capital reports. Pete?
Well, thank you very much, Dick. You've assembled a very, very vibrant committee members, and I appreciate their volunteer commitment to this committee. You have a lot of responsibilities, primarily looking at the financials, capital, reserve funds, and all those responsibilities for providing advisement not only to the governing board but to the community. One standard component of the BNF committee meetings is the financials and capital update. Just a little background. Most of you are probably aware of this, but the fiscal year for our association is June 30th. We then enter into an external audit done primarily in the months of July and August. Within the audit firm will then present their reports in October 18th. However, until then, all these financials that we present, including the ones I'm presenting today, are in what we call draft status. And until those are actually closed out, we can't reset our general ledger balances for absoluteness. So you won't really be seeing July, August, even maybe September until we get to the October 18th period. So a little background. So what you are going to see, though, is the fiscal year 22 of the period of July 21 to June 30th in its draft status. Like any new committee, there may be terminologies that we present, and I might even use acronyms that you may or may not be familiar with. Normally, after I present, if I'm using such terminologies, I would enter into a Q&A session, and we can still do that, but we're somewhat unique today that Cliff Swan, our accounting manager for the association, is going to be doing a presentation that very likely will answer a lot of the questions that you're posing. So I would maybe ask you to skip through that Q&A, and we'll wait for him to present, and then we'll open it up then. With that said, first of all, the financials are published, and I see all of you are given a hard copy, and any owner members out there that want to look online, you can see our financials that are attached to the agenda, but they are very busy, they're very compact and have a lot of data on it. And so in the past committees, they've asked me to summarize the data into the form of this presentation, which has usually been met with great acceptance, but you always will have access to those reports. If anybody is interested in not only what is attached, but also financials, they're also on the website, as is our budget, as is a whole host of financial information. I would tell you that before I start, some of the numbers are are large in capacity, like millions of dollars, so we truncate those down so that it's, 15 million will be like 15.0 and such. So otherwise these slides get really, really elongated and more zeros on them than what you're looking at, what the results are. So for FY22, start with the operating revenues. There was about 27.2 million collected. Budget was 25.2. We had an excess of 2.1 million. I would note that I'll be communicating some notable events here in a second, but for those that may or may not be aware, these revenues were generated without any increase in dues in the FY21 or 22. There was no increase in golf rate sheets other than a small increase in some cart rentals, no increase in lineage fees. So all of this really came pretty much through increases from things that were shut down during COVID, such as special events, and some bowling was limited to split lanes and things like that, but we didn't really do any of it on the backs of rate hikes. So this, well, that first one was against budget. This one's against prior year. Golf had more rounds played. We saw a considerable amount of more outside play and resident play and guest play, all of which are some of the more higher rated fees in the golf arena. For those that know, you probably remember, but FY21 had significant shutdowns in our guest fees. And so when those rejuvenated, we saw a considerable increase, plus transaction fees, which are levied every time there's a title change on your property. We had enormous amounts of asset preservation fees and such transaction fees due to an extremely robust housing market in the past year. Special events absolutely went dormant, no surprise there, and those have rejuvenated. I mentioned bowling was on split lanes and restrictions and even closures. And then food and beverage, merchandise, other, two Sentinel events there. Lizard Acres was opened in July of 21 and has proven to be very popular social gathering area. And the food and beverage at the golf courses was also limited, very limited for seating, and so it's rejuvenated itself. And again, these are all discretionary, did not come on the backs of any rate hikes or dues on any owner member that did not see any increase in their dues. Moving to the expense side, overall 24 million, 24.1 against a budget of 23.7. There's a bunch of detail in there, but I would highlight that one Sentinel event occurred in Seed due to a variety of factors. The price went up exponentially, and so the governing board was presented with a facts and findings for out of norm expenditure, and they approved that. That amount was just under 300,000 and is in the line up there under landscape maintenance. So again, everything's highlighted in thousands of dollars, so that 0.36 is actually 360,000. So barring the seed acquisition, we were actually very, very close to budget. Some notable expenses, I mentioned seed already. No surprise on chemicals and fertilizers for our courses. There's been instances that we've seen upwards of 200%, and even, but a considerable amount of chemicals and fertilizers have had 100% and even greater price increases over the last year, primarily because, I don't know how many of you know, but a considerable amount of those come out of Russia and Ukraine. So there was a limited number of suppliers, and so that drove up the price. Three other notable items on here. One, the first one is labor cost. We ran very much understaffed due to some of the the shortage of people coming out of COVID and what we call the Great Resignation. It was very, very difficult to find that, and so it's listed as a positive, but I do want to give a lot of credit to some people who continued to execute on the upkeep, maintenance, and staffing of our association. It's not listed on here, but down in repair and maintenance, there were a couple large dollar items for sure, but general inflation really, really hit us there. Supply chain really hit us hard. But also in repair and maintenance, some things that we might have done in-house before were contracted out. We just didn't have the staff to do it. So there were occasions when some tree trimmings or other things that we might have done before aerifications were done through a contract. And then a lot of people don't know, but credit card fees is somewhat reflective, not of any kind of necessarily increased amount, but the excess revenue of about $2.5 million that we saw, of course, had some carry forward on it. Plus, more people are using credit cards. Every year we see more transition from people paying through a check or even cash coming into membership for their dues, and they're using the online portal now. So overall, 27.2, as I mentioned, operating revenue. We did have an operating cash positive of 3.1 million, the budget of 1.5, and so again, on mostly the backs of discretionary spending, the in operating cash inflow, which is you're going to hear more about this, which is by policy automatically infused into the reserve funds for future capital repair and maintenance. It had a positive environment of a 1.7. Moving to the capital related, asset preservation fees is our most notable infusion of reserve funds. Represents almost 70% of the reserve fund contributions. Almost 5.8 million was collected on those fees. 4.5 was the budget, so real strong favorable there. Investment income slightly exceeded, primarily because our bond funds are generating more revenue or yield than was anticipated. The market has market valuations of the reserve funds themselves. Had a tough last year, primarily due to the market that a lot of you have seen, where in somewhat unprecedented, at least in less than 40 years, where both the bond markets and the equity markets both had down periods. So there was definitely an offset there. Our non-cash entries of depreciation and the gain or loss on sale of assets were pretty close to budgets. So overall, the capital related did have a negative impact of 1.6 million. And we were hoping for a 0.5. We don't ever budget for realized or unrealized because nobody can predict the future on that, but that's where the main impact occurred, of course. I mentioned APF transactions. Over time, we use a historical average of about 1,200 APF units has been the norm for well over 6, 7, 8 years. So to have a year where 1,600 transactions occurred was just phenomenal, and I'm sure many of you have seen that when you either were valuing your own property or made a transaction. It didn't take long for that usually to move. I mentioned already the reserve fund valuation change. So then we call the overall is the operating cash flow, and you'll hear more from Cliff on this. It might be confusing to some, like what flows into operating, what flows into capital related, and he'll explain that in more detail. But again, the 3.1 million on operating was offset by a decline in the capital related portion. So overall, a $1.5 million revenues over or under expenses, and the budget was for 2. So we had a shortfall of about $500,000, mostly driven by the capital related portion. Again, I would normally open up for Q&A on that, but mention that you'll hear more from Cliff in a second. The second part I always present is the capital related portion. It's a big part of your role here is to in the upcoming budget and the past, and you're going to hear more about that, so I won't elaborate too much, but every month we provide an update on what was the approved governing board projects and how are we doing on the spend against those project estimates, approved amounts, I should say. I say projected because we use a term called encumbered, and basically the encumbrance means that at June 30th, we don't close our books. Anything the governing board, on capital items, I should say, anything the governing board has approved, we establish a liability out on the balance sheet to hold a liability for the spend of capital that may have been already started but not paid for, something that wasn't even begun at all. So projected at this time on the 5.3 is about a 1% or so, 43,000. That of course will change. And then some of you know what this means. Most of you probably have seen it, but as we enter into the budget period, you're going to hear phrases called allowances. So the governing board gives the general manager the approval to have expenditures in the capital realm of areas such as IT and ADA, safety and security, equipment failures, a bunch of them, but it allows him to spend on the capital for things that were not necessarily identified within the specific line items approved. We came within about 4,000, so that unspent allowance just remains in the reserve funds and isn't part of the transfer. So a favorable performance there too. That's the summary of my financials. Again, I know you would have questions, but I'll allow him to, Cliff, to do his portion, and then we'll go from there. My next section is on capital, and this year, as I said, started on July 1, and yeah, Bill, yeah, thank you. No, that's the policy, yeah. And that's the last one. Why don't you go to the actual agenda under...
It's actually under new business under 5.01.
Yeah, so Dave, can you go to the agenda? Oh yeah, there it is, perfect, thank you. All right, so real quick summary is that normally I would be presenting what we've actually issued purchase orders on, what has been the actual expenditures against that, favorable or unfavorable. But very, very few items have actually been ordered, purchased, summarized. So with so many new members on the committee, I thought what we do is present the high dollar items that are within this year, fiscal year 23's capital budget, so that when they start to move forward, you'll have some idea of what those were. The largest item was for starting next April, 6.6 million for the Grandview irrigation and turf reduction project. In addition, next summer, they will move to do a shoreline repair and replacement with all the emphasis on groundwater preservation and the ADWRs, the water resources component of the government has very elevated restrictions on what water can be permitted to be thrown, and these projects serve to help us by retaining more of the water and less seepage and things like that. And plus they provide a nice image for the community. Every year, of course, we have a ton of probably 40 or 50 pieces of equipment at each of our 7 courses. This last year, the governing board approved 31 of those to move forward, approximately 180,000 per course, or 4 units per course. The amount of that, it was just over $1 million for equipment and 234,000 for utility vehicles. The specific breakout of that is listed, and you can look at any time if you'd like, as is the vehicles. Our last 3 years, we've moved to replace a very aging carts. These became very, very difficult to get with the golf's popularity, but we do seek these out every year for replacement. Carl is here, and he'll be able to speak to some of the things he's done, but just outside the hall, you probably saw all the graders going on. That's what they're working on, is the bottom half of that slide of there. It's 2 components. The bottom part over by the library, extending up towards where the pickleball courts are. That's phase 1, and then phase 2 is up towards the art building. And this is an investment that's so to speak, the last of our rec centers. We've done 3 other rec centers of converting all the internal lightings to LED. Glad to say that our utility savings on the 3 rec centers are very, very evident. And so when this is done, probably in the later part of the year, we're very much anticipating similar type savings for the association going forward. Carl does a great job of maintaining our roofs. We very much have a very preservatory type strategy on these by using restorations versus full replacements, and that's proven to be very, very, very cost efficient. So we have one of those, at least of one material one at R.H. Johnson this fiscal year. Mini golf's a very popular amenity. The lights out there are very, very difficult and very pricey to replace. So this strategy of getting in there and replacing them will be money very well spent, because it takes like cranes to do a replacement, and some of those bulbs are like $1,000 a pop. It's crazy. One other parking lot that is moving forward in the next, maybe even now, is the Deer Valley Pro Shop. These are what we call new items. These are not within our reserve study. They were identified for the governing board to consider, and they moved forward. And any questions you may have on some of these in greater detail, I'd probably ask Carl to address. But for the most part, on this one, there was an access point into the association from that used to be a staging point for when this association was being built out, and that wall stopped there because of the right-of-way going through there, and so they're petitioning to the government, to the county, to see if that walls can be extended, primarily because of a little bit of unsightliness, but also we get quite a bit of intrusion in through there. Metal Shop just had their expansion, and the parking lot was ripped up pretty bad through all that, and it made for a perfect time, because I think that was up for renewal anyway in the reserve study, and it was a good time to get it done. And then security also came into forefront over at Beardsley. Some access points into some clubs and or storage areas were being compromised, so this elevated gates. This has already been completed, and it's doing the effect of very, very, actually came in quite a bit below budget too, so you'll be pleased to hear that. And then I already mentioned the allowance. I mentioned 88 well pumps, IT, safety, structural, facility improvements, energy conservation, apart from that LED that we were talking about, any other projects. And of course, unanticipated is being the whole phrase of allowance. That's what it's there for. But any given time, anything that exceeds 50,000 on any of these projects requires by policy that the general manager present a facts and findings for the governing board to consider for any kind of approval to proceed. And that, of course, is prevalent in the allowances as well. So that was my, I do have any questions, especially while Carl's here on the capital and before Cliff comes up. So any questions on the capital portion?
Dick, I
Yeah,
have
John?
some
Yes.
questions, may I?
Yes.
Relative to the golf, the maintenance, we had a quite large expenditure on the maintenance equipment. Is that part of a normal annual type of expense, or was there a surge that we faced to get to that? You know, should we anticipate similar numbers
Right.
going forward, or is that maybe catch up and things just all broke at once?
No, actually the opposite. Thank you, John. As a comparison, I've been here 3 years. The first year, I believe, was just under $1 million for the two combined components. The year we just finished, FY21, two had almost 1.5 million, maybe even 1.7 million when you add in vehicles. So, no, that's kind of right in the middle. So.
Good. That's I thought that would be good educational
Sure.
background for people,
Sure.
because we can expect that going forward as well. It's sort of baked in to keep things the way they need to be kept. The second question is similar. It's about the parking lots. I know we did Palm Ridge, and these things are obviously needed. I'm not questioning the expense. What I'm thinking about is, are there more of these to come in the future years, or have we caught up and fixed neglect and they're behind us? So, Carl, just your insight would be useful. Thank you.
Yep, very good question. I've been sharing this information over the last couple of years that after a full review in my 5-year tenure here, that our asphalt and roof program is monitored very extensively, and it is our plan that virtually every parking lot that we have here is met its 40 years plus useful life, and some have been restored with different means over the years, but it is our plan to fully replace all asphalt throughout the whole community, and I would say we're probably a little bit more than 50% complete.
Thank you. That's perfect. Coons looks great. The jobs that have been done really do enhance the community, and we have to keep things up for our living standards. So again, it's just, what do we need to anticipate going forward in our expenses?
I'd like to add too that the community asks this question quite often, is that after we actually replace a parking lot with new asphalt, you'll see on your operational approvals later on in the budget cycle that we place considerable dollars that 1 year later those parking lots actually have to get their first seal coat. So I just want to use that as a little bit of educational moment, that what the year do you determine to replace the asphalt, the following year you seal it for the very first time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. Question I have is, when is the Trail Ridge parking lot scheduled to be replaced? It's looking terrible, and as a weekly visitor, as part of the men's club, it's just not something that is putting our best foot forward. If it is not scheduled to be done, how quickly could it be scheduled to be done?
I recall that project to have a couple more years of expected useful life, and after review, it is my opinion that it's being put on this upcoming budget that we're getting ready to start, so that will be a next year project if approved.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Christine, are you on? Do you have any questions? Okay, thank you very much.
I'm on, and I have no questions
Thank you.
beyond what was already asked. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Cliff, are you going to do the next session? Cliff has a presentation on research.
Keeping things up. I like that descriptor. That's very relevant in what I'm going to talk about here right now with the reserve fund. So good morning, everyone. Cliff Swan, Accounting Manager. Good to see you, committee. Welcome aboard to the new members, and hello, community. So we're going to talk a little bit about the reserve fund. We're going to start out, talking about what it is, and then we're going to talk about why we need it. And then we're going to get into some of the weeds with how we calculate our reserve fund allocation. And then finally, we'll talk about what's the health of that reserve fund and kind of how we sit compared to our industry. So let's get started. So what is the reserve fund? The technical definition, I guess I would apply to it, is that a reserve fund sets aside money for covering scheduled routine and unscheduled expenditures that would otherwise be drawn from a general fund. So kind of what does that mean? So we have an operating account that we fund everything throughout the year. So our operations and capital spend. At the end of the year, based on our audited financial statements, we come up with a operating cash flow and determine if we draw from that reserve fund or if we allocate or put more funds, inject into the reserve fund. So we have a policy structured specifically for our reserve fund. It's FI 04. And, some of the key takeaways from that policy are the policy is set for a fund to be established to pay for capital expenditures. So capital expenditures are anything over $5,000 with a useful life of at least 5 years. Well, they include anything for repair and replacement, and then also any new capital or new assets we may decide to do through 5-year planning or through master planning, or if we need to add a gate like Pete showed earlier, that's all new capital for us, and those items get added to our reserve study. Our policy also states that the reserves are funded through the association's operating cash flow per the annual audited financial statements, and that our reserve fund will be at least 40% of the fully funded balance of our reserve study. We'll get into all these things later on in the presentation. So why do we have a reserve fund? Well, this is a beautiful community. The amenities here are amazing. And, it takes funds to keep these up and keep them looking beautiful. So that's why we have a reserve fund. So this is a timeline of Sun City starting in 1978. I guess I got to put a 19 in front now. 1978 with our groundbreaking. And through 1995, that says Trail Ridge. It's actually Desert Trails. That's a typo. But all of these amenities over the last 40 plus years are aging. And our reserve fund is set aside so that we have money to enhance and repair these facilities. If you walk into the social hall, for example, you'd never know that building is 40 years old. And it's because of the diligence we have with our reserve fund and the diligence we put into maintaining that facility and all the rest of the facilities. But the facilities are aging. The infrastructure is 40 plus years old. The parking lots, the drainage, all the things you don't see, the roofs, the air conditioning units, it all adds up. The cost of maintaining and enhancing those amenities and our facilities are rising. They are rising significantly. So one of the things that impacts that obviously is inflation. This is a 20-year plus look at inflation rates. And I've added a trend line in here to show you how inflation is trending, and it is going up. I think inflation rates just came out this morning for August, and it was down a tick, 2 ticks. It's 8.3% right now, year over year. Operating expenses. So we talked a little about that operating fund that we have. Okay, well, our operations are all of the facilities that we have here and the cost to maintain those operations. Okay, so this is separate from capital. So capital is used to repair and replace items over $5,000 with a 5-year useful life. Operating is all the payroll, salaries, wages and benefits, utilities, landscape maintenance, all those things go into our operating expenses, and those are following the same trend line if you look at the 5-year trend. Now, talking about capital, the replacement cost of the reserve study assets. So back in 2018, our reserve asset estimate was roughly $63 million. We estimate that the value of those assets through budget year 2023 will go up to $98 million. You'll see in 2020 there was a large jump, and that was due to a revaluation of our irrigation and turf replacement at our golf courses. We were significantly underestimated there on a reserve study, and Pete spent a lot of time, and Bill and Todd, looking at that and adjusting those expenditures. But from there forward, you could see the impact of inflation, and also any new assets that get added also get added on the reserve study. So that increases the value, and those assets continue to increase over time, the value of those assets. So what makes up our reserve fund? Well, the components of our reserve fund are what we inject through our operating cash inflow outflow and our APF fees, adjusted for capital spend and encumbrance. And then we have our our investment income and our market changes. So when you wrap all that together, that gives us our reserve fund balance. How is our association funded? So I talked earlier, we've got operations and capital. So in our operations, you can see our funding sources there. So we have membership revenue, golf, bowling, special events, some of our ancillary revenue, cell towers, rentals, driving range income. We have our merchandise, food and beverage, and rec fees. So these are all of our funding sources for our operations, which have expense offsets. And then down in the bottom section, you'll see capital, which is our investment income and our APF fees. All of these funding sources are what funds our reserve fund. And I've called out the membership revenue. Our dues assessments, really, when you look at all these funding sources, are the only guaranteed source of funding for us. All the rest of these funding sources are impacted by what's going on in the economy. Consumer spending, inflation. Membership dues is the only source that's pretty much guaranteed for us. So when we put those funding sources on a pie chart, you'll see that membership, golf, and APF fees are the largest portion of our funding sources. Keeping in mind, those funding sources go to fund our operations as well as our capital. So let's talk about operating cash inflow outflow. There's been a lot of discussion about this recently, and I firstly want to say this is not profit for the association. We are a 501c4. Okay? Per policy, our operating cash flow is a direct component of our reserve fund calculation, a very important one. Okay? It funds our operations, but at the bottom line of that, whatever's left over goes into our reserve fund. Okay? So our operating revenue minus our operating expenses gives us our operating cash inflow or outflow. So Pete touched on this earlier. For fiscal year 22, $27 million in operating revenue, $24 million in operating expense, $3.1 million operating cash inflow for us, directed to the reserve fund per policy. So Pete again talked about this earlier. We had some huge windfalls year over year in some of those funding sources, okay? All discretionary spending, every cent of it, okay? And this was a huge windfall for our reserve fund. This was a good thing for us. Don't know that we can count on that year over year. I mean, we're staring at a possible recession. You know, things, again, these are impacted. We don't have complete control over these items, these funding sources. So, what was the impact of that $3.1 million inflow? Well, if we look at our reserve fund calculation for fiscal year 22, we take that 3.1 million, we add to it our APFs, and we subtract from that our capital spend. So 5.7 million last year in capital spend, 3.1 million inflow, and 5.8 million APFs leaves us a $3.2 million injection or allocation into our reserve fund. So with that $3.2 million injection, what does that put our reserve fund balance at the end of fiscal year 22? So we take our beginning of the year or ending year 21 balance of 30.8 million. We add to it our $3.2 million cash inflow, and then we have to adjust with our investment income and our capital section and our market change. Unfortunately, when we combine all that together, we lost $3 million in valuation in our investment. So fortunately, we had that 3.2 million, and we're back right where we started in at the end of fiscal year 21. The graph to the right, you can see what our reserve fund balance has done for the past 5 years and what we budget for next year. So the balance in there fluctuates. That doesn't necessarily mean we're in bad shape if it goes down. So how do we know what the financial health of our reserve fund is? Well, our standard for an acceptable reserve is set at least 40% of the fully funded balance. That's an industry standard for associations of our size. What is the fully funded balance? The fully funded balance, or FFB, is a mathematically derived balance that provides one answer to the question as to how much should be in the reserve fund at any given point in time. What does that mean? So again, let's talk about the reserve study. This is how we arrive at our fully funded balance. So we take the assets, which I'll say again, the cost of at least $5,000 and a useful life at least 5 years. Currently, there are 1,200 plus items in the reserve study. Okay, these are all the roofs, the asphalt, the equipment that Pete talked about earlier, the golf equipment, air conditioners, all the items in the facilities with a $5,000 value and at least a 5-year useful life. So the fully funded balance equals the used portion of those assets adjusted for inflation. That's the fully funded balance. So what does that look like now? So cost versus fully funded balance. This is a categorized list of our reserve study. You'll see the main categories here to the left, the current cost of those assets, and then the fully funded balanced value of those assets. So at the end of fiscal year 22, roughly 94 million in cost, roughly 58 million in fully funded balance. So just a couple of things to talk about here. If you look at HVAC units, you'll see there's roughly 2.5 million in HVAC unit cost and 763K in fully funded balance. We've recently replaced many of those units. So the fully funded balance is 30 or so % of the cost. If you go up to landscape and irrigation, we talked about the community being 40 plus years old. A lot of the landscape and irrigation projects that are on the reserve study are almost at their fully funded life. So the value of those is roughly 70%, the fully funded value. all right? So, well, you know, all of these 1,200 plus items come on and come off at different times of you know, of the lifing of those items, and then the used value of that is what the fully funded balance is. So, fully funded balance percent is really how we gauge how healthy our reserve fund is. So we take our ending reserve fund from the prior year, we adjust it for the allocation or the draw from the finished year. So 27.7 plus 3.2, we take that 31 million and divide it by that fully funded value, the fully funded balance of those assets, and that gives us our FFB percent, which is 54%. And again, we have a consultant that we employ to give us his opinion on what our association risk assessment is. And he puts it on this little gauge here, and he has us at a medium risk, which is the 30 to 70% range for fully funded balance. Now, again, policy FI04 states that we have to be at least 40%, so we're well within policy. What I'll say here is when we talked about FI04 states that the reserve funds are used for the repair and replacement of those assets. It's also used for new capital. So anything new that we have to do here also is funded through this reserve fund. Historically, if we looked at the cost of assets in our fully funded balance, you can see 70% in 2018, probably not too accurate based on the value of the cost of assets and the fully funded balance, through 54% last year, and with our budgeted a budget that was just passed in May for fiscal year 23, we estimate the FFB percent to be 47%. So we have an $11 million capital spend budgeted for fiscal year 23. But you could see what's happening here is inflation is hitting the cost of those assets. Because if it were dollar for dollar, those assets would just come off the reserve study, and your fund would pay for those, and then they would reset, and the FFB would reset. But with the cost of inflation, you can see our fully funded balance percentage is going down. Now, if we hit it out of the park again, and discretionary spending is great, and we add another 6,000 rounds to golf, this could change. But, modeling this out, this is what it looks like for us. Okay, so having a reserve study, you're planning for the inevitable, right? You know that these things need to be replaced, these assets. So a reserve study provides the current estimate of the cost of repairing and replacing major common area components such as roofs and pavement over the long term. I like this quote. I saw it when I was doing some research, and it kind of goes to right what we're talking about here. Is you can have a plan. It doesn't, plan's great, but if you can't execute it, you can't go through the process, and you can't model it out, it doesn't mean anything. So it's not just about the plan; it's also about the planning. Any questions?
I would like to open it up. Frank, I know that you have a question.
I do. Let me hand Cliff a copy of a spreadsheet that I put together.
We'll want to be able to view or to have that explained so everyone can see that.
Okay. And
Okay.
How do I get everyone to see?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure, but we're in a situation where I don't want the discussion to be between you and Cliff.
Oh, of course not.
I want this to be so everyone listening and in this room can see and hear the same thing.
Understood.
So, okay.
Can we bring up the end of year financial, the P&L for June 30, 22, please? and I'll be able to point to the numbers on the screen so people can maybe get a better understanding if that works.
Is this a document that was provided to us, Frank?
No, I think if you go to the agenda, you can pull it up. We had it up earlier. It's the profit and loss statement for the end of year.
If we can find this, I think it's fine, but I really don't want to proceed if we don't have visual that everybody can.
Yeah, we've got the profit and
Okay,
loss
good.
statement.
All right, okay.
Right there in the middle. There you go.
Yeah, that's correct.
Go.
One of the things that I've been following for the past year has been the financial statements, and I've watched as that windfall grew larger and larger over the past 12 months. It certainly didn't come as a surprise to me. I went ahead and I did a modified version of a cash flow statement, and budgeted amount, when I look at net cash from operations, if you look at the bottom of the column there, it shows $1,451,000, okay? I added to that investment income, which is net of fees. I added in the asset preservation fees, and I took out the capital project expenditures. You can see a little bit further down in the capital-related items. As an example, your asset preservation fees, they were budgeted at $4,440,000. The column to the left shows that it's more like $5.8 million. The bottom line is that based on this spreadsheet, I see a net cash available that was budgeted of about $598,000, but that the actual results by the end of the year were $5.2 million, which is more than 9 times what was budgeted. The windfall is wonderful, but I now see that we took in a dues increase for the current year and some major increases in the cost of golf. If we see another windfall that comes in at the end of this year, wouldn't it be prudent to think about perhaps distributing some of that windfall back to the residents? Perhaps the policy needs to be looked at. And that's really all I have to say about that.
Let me make a couple comments about that. First of all, we are in the process of reviewing all of the financial policies. As a matter of fact, FI4, which is the policy on the reserve fund, is scheduled for the next meeting, which is October 4th. Okay, so that is going to be a critical date for us to look at that. So I don't know, Cliff or Pete, can you respond to the balance of the issue here?
No, I'm not, I don't have a document that supports those, and we presented all ours, so if I get a chance to review it, I'll either do it separately with him or in the next meeting.
This is awkward. We can't really do this without some public, time to look at it. I would like to table your question until next meeting. Can we do that? Is that parliamentarian? Can we?
Yes, we'll call it unfinished business as a part of this line item. But I
Okay.
do request in the future that any outside documentation has to be provided to me in
Okay.
advance. Thank you.
Understood. Thank
Very
you.
reasonable. Thank you very much, Karen. Okay, so I don't, okay, so we're going to table this. I think it's best, Frank, if you can confer with Pete and Cliff, and I would like to be involved in that conversation so we can get the exact issue. We want to address you have a very well thought out question, and I think it deserves an answer. So we do want to get to that. All righty, so we're going to table this, do consultation, and we'll bring it back at the next budget meeting. Is that satisfactory?
Absolutely.
Okay. The floor is still open for questions or comments from the committee?
Yes, Dick, I have a comment and
Please.
and a question. First of all, I'd like you to weigh in, Cliff and Pete, on the statement I'm about to make. It would seem that in fiscal '22, the biggest impact that's caught me by surprise is inflation, as far as readjusting some base numbers that were in there. Is that an accurate assessment?
No question. Inflation permeates throughout our whole presentation. And when you have the elevated amount that it is, it does damage in so many places. And we'll talk separately with Frank, but that's why the biggest risk to our reserve study, as I think Cliff hopefully animatedly showed you, was that the cost of our replacement items are not a stagnant number. It's real-time updated with the current pricings. If you have a $98 million valuation the way it resides today, up almost $4 million in just 4 months since we closed our books, or gave the estimated amount that Cliff highlighted there. The reserve funds have only the 3 or 4 contributions. It's your income coming off of the reserve funds you have. How well are you funded on the APFs, which has their own risks right now, which is mortgage rates are increasing, home prices are elevating or slowing down. And so that's a big portion of that. The operating represents about 20%, and it has thousands of inputs, thousands. Dues are one piece of it. But if a recession, as Cliff alluded to, did some damage on any of the discretionary spending, i.e. in the entertainment amenities, golf or bowling being the most notable, if we come in short, then the impact onto the contribution into the reserve funds would be compromised as well. We do our best to keep you alerted to those through monthly updates. We do it throughout the year. Valuation changes, and we'll be talking more about this when Cap Trust, our investment advisor, speaks in October, scheduled quarterly as part of our policy. All of these are spokes into it. It's not just one item that emerges. And while I respect what you're saying, Frank, it's the most notable item is people's dues, is no question. We rely very much on that operating margin. And when factors impact it, good and bad, they're either celebrated in a year when the infusion is better than expected, or if it's lowered, then it does damage to that FFV percent. Now, we'd like to have enough gap between our estimate of where we stand as of any point in time to our base floor of 40%, but recognize that Mr. Schwind out here in the audience is also faced with not just repair and replacement of everything, but also planning for capital spend. And as Cliff alluded to, we don't set a separate allowance up for that. The 54%, if you infused $1 million today in some unexpected item, it would have the effect of dropping it by about 2 percentage points just with that decision. Now, on October 4th, you're going to get not just further Q&A, but you'll see what we anticipate for new capital spend, for APF infusions, for our operating margins, for our capital spend. And all of those, every one of them, not just one single, but every one of them has a very vital part of how we anticipate where we're going to be in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years. And we do our best to communicate, where that percent would be to maintain the health. And we give the general manager and the community, what the picture is at any given time. And it's not static. It can change with a recession. It can change. And my point is that inflation is kind of the evil denominator out there. If you are stagnant on your inflows, If you're stagnant on your APS and you're operating and your capital replacements just intrinsically start moving up by 5 and 10%, when our modeling calls for about 3%, which has been the 10-year average of, inflation, if that takes root, then that 98 million turns into 103 million and into 107 million, and suddenly your reserve percentage doesn't look so hot. So we've got to be very cognizant of how we react to those factors in the community, in the industry. So that's why there's a lot going into it. We give you the opportunity to see that on October 4th.
May I?
Thank you. Yes, John.
Re-engage?
Yes.
I noticed the reserve percentage was, the projection, if you will, for next year was 47. Toward the end of fiscal 22, we were looking at hitting that number after the last of the irrigation jobs, as I remember. Perhaps, I'm going to say 3 years out from what it is, so it's accelerated. Now, since our funding reserves went down a little bit through market losses, that's understandable, but it would seem like what prompted my initial comment is the other number in that equation, the denominator, had to spike quite a bit, and that would have been through inflationary expectations beyond the 3%. I think you've validated my concern there because it can change. You get a whipsaw effect out of that inflation. It's dynamic and it's hidden. Now, with that, if that holds and people understand what I've said, and you sort of agree with my conclusion on that, I'd like to ask about the pie chart back about the middle of the presentation.
Yeah.
The 17%.
Can you bring that presentation back
and
up, Dave?
The discussion.
It was in clips.
The discussion that dealt with the sources funds. We brought in almost 5.8, 5.7 million in APF. I've always viewed that as the biggest contributor to our reserves, and the second biggest being the membership. So can you maybe provide a little more detail on that construction of that pie chart? Yep, it was there. That shows membership being the biggest source. And of course,
Yeah.
those along your comments. So for some reason, I disconnected.
Okay. So our funding sources fund our operations and our capital. So the funding source of membership being 45% in golf, the two of those being 76% of our total funding, and APFs being 17%.
You're talking about total community funding?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
I
thought I interpreted that to be the funding of the reserve.
No. So
Thank
this
you.
goes.
The mystery is now
Okay, good.
cleared up.
Yes. And I'll kind of reiterate what you just came to, and just to make sure everybody else understands. All of those funding sources fund not only our capital spend, but also in our reserve fund, but also our operations. Thanks, John.
Makes perfect sense now.
Good question.
I understand Gary Bosak is on. Gary, I don't know if you've been on long enough to create a question, or if you want to just acknowledge you're there. Well, outside of that, we'll go on. Any other questions?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
I can, Gary. Thank you. Yep.
Just arrived from Mars. No, actually, I missed. I've been on the phone for everything except the introductions, and I'll catch up to those on the YouTube video replay. But Cliff, you've done a fabulous job of putting some context and meaning into a very complicated subject in a way that I think everybody can understand. And I don't know that anybody's ever done as well with that. So congratulations to you. My questions, Dick, more relate to the P and L, and I think those would probably be better served coming later.
That's fine, thank you.
I would only have one follow-up to John.
Okay.
We talk about external factors, and Bill Schwinn highlights this at almost virtually every meeting, and that's, we are a golf community. It's founded with, that as a centerpiece, if you will. And as such, you don't have to pick up a paper and read about the arid, the Lake Mead levels and water restrictions come and everything. And while we get our water through groundwater, through those rights, we still want to do everything in our power to manage that well. I mentioned earlier about the irrigation systems will assist in that with less turf to water. We do that through the lake shorelines to prevent seepage. But at the core of it, it's how much water you're allowed to irrigate onto your plain surfaces that you want to keep green. And it's interesting, John, because we actually did alter the timetables. Every time you think you're lined up for when are you going to do some of these replacement projects, the ADWR steps in with possibly new criteria. So you had an astute eye. We actually did have some of those courses out further, but they had to be moved up primarily to make that deturfing, to hit our make sure we're within our allocation. So, external factors hit you literally every day, and that, I'll say it again for the 10th time, it's a placeholder where we stand today. In a week, in a day, in a year, it can change through millions of factors. So we always just try to assess and give our best estimate of the reserve funds are viewed oftentimes as a stagnant number. We just mentioned earlier, there's a lot of stuff going on throughout the year that will impact that, good or bad. The cost could be changing through inflation, adding or deleting, if we bring on a new project, something unexpected happens that the community wants. Master planning, we want you to be the mouthpiece of as a committee. That's your role, is to assess some of these assessments and give good guidance to the governing board. So it's a vital role.
Can I
think
add
you've
something
had.
to that?
Yes, go ahead.
And also, when you take a look at the reserve study, it was brought up earlier, one of the parking lots, moving that up on the reserve study. We have the luxury and the ability to do that because of how we plan and reserve for those funds. If we didn't do that, we wouldn't be able to do such things. And we definitely don't want to have to ever come to the community and ask for a special assessment to do something as well. So this is something that's built into our modeling, and we account for those types of things. So, and we take them into account when we're projecting these things out.
And I think one other thing that I'd like to add to that is one of the things that we haven't even talked about is when we start playing these what if scenarios about new things happening, new projects, new buildings, new programs. And we haven't even gone there yet. And I'm not going to ask you, Pete, where the money would come from with that, because I think I know. But that's just editorial, and I think it's something that we all have to keep in the back of our mind as well.
Yeah.
So
at the end of the day, it's all about the reserve fund. It really is. At the end of the day.
Let me just make a comment, and I think I'm right on this, but I want you to. Right now we're at 54%. We've planned. We knew that we were going to drop. Our reserve fund was going to drop, but it's dropping to 47. That's the projected drop. That's walking very close to the edge, and I think that I'm not nervous about that, but I would be nervous about it if it dropped another 2 or 3%. And I think that that's something that could happen very quickly.
May
John,
I make additional comment about that? In terms of what ifing, as you alluded to, Pulling a job forward like an irrigation job, a major job of $3 million, I did a quick calculation, so anybody that's actually good with numbers might want to check this, but I believe you're talking about a 5 or 6% change in that reserve percentage. And I think that's what we're seeing. That's what shocked me. I was prepared for that 47% to creep up. Suddenly, because of irrigation pull-up, that number doesn't look quite as friendly as it did. And I think as a community, it's our job to not only take care of the assets we have now, but to make sure that they're here for that whatever we've used, we return in kind and we leave the community the way we found it or better, not worse. And so my concerns are always about the unexpected. It's the exogenous variables that are going to get us. It's not going to be the things we know about. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other
Dick,
discussion?
Dick?
Yes.
Dick? I'm just listening to the conversation. I think my question would be better served now, if you don't mind.
Yeah, Gary, go ahead.
Pete, our biggest expense is payroll, obviously, and you know this committee's been very aggressive in pushing you to the staff to make adjustments in compensation to minimize the turnover and keep our best people and those sorts of things. And when I look at the year-end P&L, we're again $504,000 under what we budgeted. I know you put in place a lot of increases. Could you just address the effect that you think those increases are going to have on our biggest expense and how that fits into our ability to achieve our plan?
It is. It's people and the benefits and taxes that go along with that is in the mid-60s. It's by far our largest expense. So it's the one we, of course, is the most visible to our community, whether or not things are kept up to standards in maintenance, whether or not somebody's at membership, whether or not somebody's at a monitor station. There's literally hundreds of people manning those posts. Quite bluntly, we began to see the most notable one that people mention, and it's extremely difficult, is our golf maintenance. Across the entire industry, it's extremely been on the short end of it and resulted in the largest deficit to our FTE count. But what really cropped up a lot over the last 6 months, if not longer, was some of our rec center positions, facility assistants and monitors and things like that were becoming very, very, very difficult to fill as well. And we were facing shortages there that could have resulted in unexpected closures. And the mere fact that we were able to avoid those is a testament to our managers and stuff like that. But we needed to give them the tools. And the governing board recognized that. And this BNF committee, those that were on it last year, including yourself and John and Dick, when you before the governing board, all of them supported that. And that went a long ways towards about $1.80, or, of course, a person at the entry level is going to be a lot different dollar amount of what $1.80 means than somebody who's, a little bit higher up. But overall, that 7 or 8% was a necessary investment in order to do that. And thankfully, I checked in with our HR for what the effect has been. And we're not only hearing salient statements out from our managers that the morales and the retentions are doing good, but it's showing up in our recruitment. In the month of August, we had 18 new hires and only 5 departures. It's been a long time since we've seen some of those positive influences. And guess what? They're also occurring in those 2 categories that I just mentioned, golf maintenance and facility management. So those things are very well investment and I think the owner members will be paid off handsomely for that. And we continue to evaluate Other recruitment and retentions, some of you are on the governing board. You were presented at the workshop last week that an assessment of our holiday policy indicated that we have 9 holidays recognized. Our competitors around us, for the most part, were 10 to as much as 12. And the request was made by the general manager and to have the governing board, it was within his authority because it was only about a $8,000 impact, but he requested the governing board, so to speak, give their blessing on that, and they did so last week. So once again, we check another box of at a pretty nominal cost to address something that, you know, not only is probably the right thing to do from a, you know, recognizing our veterans, so many of which reside in this community, but also to give our staff the ability to spend time with their families, as well as get ourselves on an even playing field for competitive. And we've done a number of other things that are published in that meeting over the last year, and I think they're starting to pay off.
Thank you. Okay, one more opportunity for questions. Okay, thank you. Dr. Miller?
This may be an off-the-wall question, but clearly we're being driven by the state to reduce water on the golf courses. So we're going to go through a series of projects over so many years. We don't lose those water rights. Is that correct?
Correct.
So in essence, we're going to reduce our water usage. We're going to retain our water rights. And those rights are an asset for the community, which we, I assume, could lease to other people as a revenue stream.
Could we? Or, yeah,
Yeah,
that's
can
been
we do that?
discussed. But until we kind of got a true assessment of where we're going to stand after these assessments are done, the last thing you want to do is lease them out and then find you
Yeah,
need
I'm
them.
not saying
Yeah.
that that's something we need to do now.
Correct.
I'm kind of looking at the future
Sure.
where water becomes
Sure.
more important. And is that an asset that community
Yes.
has that we can bank on?
Yes.
So, okay. Thank you.
Dick,
John?
since we've opened it up to the operating questions, I'd ask one, and Pete, that you may want to answer this, you may want to defer to Mr. Schwinn, but is it possible to give us an assessment of where we stand with head count and versus authorizations? You've obviously made progress, 18 in, 5 out. We closed the gap at least in August. Where do we stand? Is it still a mountain you're climbing, or have we hit a steady state? This is just, again, looking into this year. What can you help us with?
Excellent observation, and you got trumped by, I forget her name, but she was on properties last week, and it wasn't a properties-related conversation, but she said, is there a way that the BNF committee, and we just had already published our agenda, and by 48-hour rule, we couldn't meet it, but you guys will be seeing in the future where we stand on the FT count, since it is such a huge portion of our expense line. It bears some conversation that we communicate where we're at. And answer to your question, I wish I could say the first month before that was great, but we had some departures. July had 17 departures and 15 hires, so we did move backwards in July. But you'll see that on the report that we present, and hopefully you'll find it educational.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Frank?
Thank you, Dick. Regarding the water rights, this is a very simple yes or no. Do we currently lease any of our water rights to anyone, or do we hold them all for ourselves?
Good question. We do actually have one longstanding agreement with Briarwood, and we've made some modifications to that recently. They were underutilizing their allotment, so we lowered their amount. This was all transparent, published within a governing board approval, and we lowered the rights, which technically goes to your point of potentially freeing it up to a even greater good. So some of those you're right, some of those rights can command a pretty hefty amount if you deem that you have the safety valve, if you will, to do it without negating your own needs first. And that has to be primary, but I think there was just a little bit preliminary to go into those before all this fleshes out and where we're going to stand. So most likely a future value, but yes, we own those rights, and it sits on the balance sheet. About 2.2 million was, so really give a lot of, and this association was extremely blessed by that forward-thinking decision. I mean, there are, Bill alludes to this in his history. He had some experience with municipal courses that are paying $500,000 a year for their water dispersal. You know, we have our groundwater, and well, yes, while we pay to pump the water out and disperse it, we're not paying anything, say, for that water. And it's just a huge savings due to the foresight of those people that made that move back in, I think, 2008.
Thank you. Last call. Thank you very much. I want to thank you and Cliff both, because I thought those were exceptionally good presentations. Very professional. Thank you. Welcome. Next is, I think it's Carl. Are you going to do yours first? Your presentation, or Pete?
Carl's going to go first. A real brief synopsis is budget and finance. Budget resides within your committee, and you're going to be presented with a global flow chart that Carl, and with a little bit of my help, but he really did the yeoman's work of evaluating the process. And so this will be helpful for you guys to understand what a huge portion of the the annual budget is to evaluate our capital spend, and you have a huge role in that. Then the operating will come into play, and I'll show some timelines on that for both you guys' role, committees, and of course, ultimately the public and the governing board. But yes, we'll start with him, and he did a great job of formulating this.
Okay, before we start, I'd like to inform the committee that pay attention to this, because we need to come to a consensus that this is a reasonable approach, and we'll talk about that after the presentations are done. Okay, Carl?
Yes, thank you for having me. You know, over the last 5 years that I've been here, it's been pretty unique to see things that I didn't expect in my role, and part of that is kind of being a neutral island at times, because we have such great ideas coming from our community that, you know, to kind of wrap that into what Pete and Cliff have shared today and how the fully funded balance operates, it's a real big deal. So you mentioned new capital and the repair and replacement of our existing assets. There's not much difference between the two, because one resides in the reserve study tool, and we track that asset and its useful life and when it should be replaced after evaluating does it need to be replaced. But each and every year we have amazing people in this community that come with new ideas, and they can be any one of you members. They could be a governing board director through an idea of their own, or a collaboration of events that are going on in the community. And most of the time, a lot of new capital comes from either master planning or a club leader having a need. So over the years, the rec centers has had policy on capital project planning processes, and that policy in 2020 was reviewed to be kind of obsolete. And not so much obsolete in the fact that it wasn't good information, it just, the flow chart and how it blended in with all the other policies' timelines, it made it problematic to make sure that we were all following policy. So Due to some great help from one of our past directors, Donna Maloney, myself, and collaboration with others, we reviewed our project planning process and came up with this new flow chart. This flow chart simply follows our policies, and it has a lot of informational blocks and triangles in there to help you as a committee understand information that the public and myself are going to present to you over this next budget season. Not much dust collects on our documents or our timeline from the time that you've, as a governing board, have approved the current year budget. Within weeks, the new capital project planning or budget cycle, is the way I like to look at it, is started and kicks off July 1st. And you'll see that evident in the policies where we have that we ask for clubs that provide like CR13 forms, which is in their booklet that governs their clubs, and then the community itself being able to come forward with new ideas. So we have a deadline by July 1st, starting off in those first green blocks that the community club leaders bring forth their ideas, and that allows the staff and myself as project management to evaluate that over the summer, if you will. If you're not familiar, that the governing board kind of takes a hiatus over the summer, and a lot of projects are done during that time frame for the benefit of what we would kind of consider low season. But also during that time frame of project initiation, you'll see that project development is happening behind the scenes in preparing for this next budget cycle. So once those ideas get collected, as you move forward in this chart, the conversations will be had with staff, and that information will be provided back from given to the general manager for consensus, and then the information given back to a club president or the person turning in an FR1 form for a new idea, and that'll allow them to understand that does this good idea, neutral idea, or maybe even sometimes a future project planning, does it fit into our business plan? So that information is then given back to the club president, whether they're going to be able to come forward to you committees and give a presentation during the budget cycle. You'll notice that over the next 3 months, September, October, and November, the capital budget development will begin. I can tell you as I sit here today that based on reviewing the reserve study tool, I look approximately 5 years out to ensure that all the repair and replacement items that we as staff have an understanding of what's coming up, because somebody that comes forward with a great idea that needs to come before the committees and the governing board, we want to do our best to align repair and replacement along with new, so that it creates the least impact to our community. So that kind of thought process happens during these summer months. And today I could say that I have a formulated capital list already. Mind you, other department managers of the rec centers also contribute to capital. I'm not the only capital manager, if you will. IT brings forth capital. Golf brings forth capital. Todd and I probably balance the largest capital information to be implemented into the budget cycle, but every department has some form of capital, and all of that capital will be shared with you over these next few months. When we're in the October and November scenario, which if you could slide this up a little bit, thank you, you'll see that any form, whether it was a FR1, which is a request for new capital, or a CR13, which is a request from a club, will be presented to you properties, charter clubs, budget and finance, if relevant, the sports pavilion committee and the golf committee. And you'll have multiple opportunities over the next 2 months to, one, either have that presenter give his or her information, and ask for their request. And then you will be able to give a recommendation to the governing board just before the December 1st deadline. So that would be at your final recommendations would basically come due at the end of November. Usually the presenters, so this particular year, I do have a couple of clubs that will be on your agenda at your next meeting and give a presentation for their capital requests. We acknowledge those CR13s and requests, like I said, as a neutral body where we take the idea, we give the best information back to the club so that they're at least successful and that you have an opinion that you can give them back based on what they say. Once October and November is complete, the policy states that December 1st, the general manager has to have the initial capital budget. From there, we'll continue into December and January, and you as, again, the committees, you will know whether or not you want to move forward with these ideas by reviewing all that capital list that's been given to the general manager over again. You'll have 2 months of opportunities to discuss, review, and then move forward to the governing board workshop in January, where the governing board will ultimately collect your recommendations and make a decision on, do any of these capital projects fall off of this list? Are they deemed one-year capital projects, meaning I could, if they were approved, I could solve that project in 1 year? Or do they require planning and engineering documents to do some further planning, and they would get a 2-year allocation or even longer if needed? So all these things work together, again, with simple requests, long-term master planning, but in October and November, you will have the opportunity to review the initial list from all departments. As we continue forward into the following season, you're going to see that the operational budget then gets implemented. And I'm going to allow Pete to elaborate on that in part of his presentation and timeline he's going to share. So that is our cycle. This document is on BoardDocs. It's very helpful for you to understand the document that Pete's going to share and our overall project planning process. So I look forward to being involved with you in that information sharing. And like I said, on the next agenda, I believe 2 particular clubs will probably be requesting some time to give new capital requests. Thank you.
Any questions for Carl? Thank you very much, Carl. Pete?
Well, he did a great job of identifying that there are, to some extent, 2 rather distinct periods within the overall financial planning budget cycle. The first half of the year is spent considerable amount on the capital formation and giving everybody ample opportunity to present their items. And ultimately, then it moves into more individualized approval and then ultimately approval by the governing board. Your role is to give consensus, as Dick alluded to earlier, to this timeline of presenting. As Carl alluded to, much of this is governed by policy, and you'll see that within our presentation, many things are identified within the calendar as being directed by policy, or at least given a general consensus that this is the time period you should be performing those tasks. Cliff did help me with this, and he's such a good designer, but in the past we had, some of you have been on previous ones, and it's kind of like, and it just was really hard to read. And you may even argue this is still that, but this first part is almost entirely summarized by what Carl was alluding to. It's just all you see is capital, capital, capital. And I'm not specifically going to go through each item because I might briefly show you in the calendar, but notice how starting in February you start to see policy FI 15.32 down to F15.33, policy 5.1, 4.1. So that's when you'll start to see your governing board directed policies makes their way into the budget. So yes, today, meaning the 13th, if you read FI 15 3.0, the budget timeline is to be reviewed and approved by B&F committee. I hope you will do so, but we're open to any modifications. Carl alluded to that actively committees over the next month, possibly either October or November, either one, you'll see charter clubs and properties, sports pavilion, golf. And then yes, you guys starting to get presentations by these people who are presented at these various committees will of course be requested to represent theirs, because you need to get an evaluation of the impact it might have on the financing portion of it. Again, I move over to November, and for the most part, it's a repeat because we give ample opportunity for people to present, and if they get questions that need to be modified, then they have some fallback period. Not a ton happens in December on either the capital or the front. It's when we start to accumulate everything and move into production mode. One specific item that starts in the operational expense side is we start to ask certain committees to give their fee recommendations. And the first one, of course, would be Sports Pavilion, and they'll evaluate their cost structure, their expected lineage, their expected other revenue or other expense components, and what do they feel like the fees should be done. And almost identical happens in golf. But they're not, you know, they're a recommendation committee only. You guys are also a recommendation, but you will assimilate all of their findings into the big picture operating income statement. We go back again in early February to some capital-related reviews, but those are more, you know, presentations. By the, probably a sentinel date is February 21st, when you as a committee, even before the governing board, obviously, you guys are given all of those items on there, you know, the operating income statement, more capital reviews, 5-year planning, FTEs, reserve fund statuses, things like that. So it's a big day on your calendar. And so then you'll note that you have almost 2 weeks, and you guys as a committee are authorized, a little strong word, but you guys are sanctioned to have 2 meetings per month. During that budget period, you probably will make effect of that. Some months you might not need to, but the 21st to right there on the February or March 7th, you will have 2 weeks for whatever you saw in the initial income statement. And this worked very well last year. The committee came up with probably 10 recommendations, some of which, the vast majority of which we incorporated into our second presentation. And then you'll be able to see the effects of those individual line items. And then move to 3 days later, the outcrop of your recommendations will be presented to the board, not for discussion in any way. It's simply a distribution of those. They then are given 1 full month to formulate their questions and concerns as the ultimate deciders of the budget. And on April 7th, they then have a full workshop to review all those aspects of the budget. The community is allowed to voice their interjections. We have by policy, and we've decided to do a daytime and a nighttime to allow for various people's schedules. And at this time, we've commissioned those 2 dates for them to review what they saw. And then to the regular meeting on the 20th, the governing board by policy will make individual approval of anything over, any capital items over 100 grand at that time. Then we move into kind of the home stretch, if you will. We allow for you guys for further interjection based on what you saw on the governing board's decisions or the open forums with the community. Again, your recommendations may be implemented or not. The governing board's then given a workshop to do any kind of their reviews of what they heard. And hopefully all of those items will be addressed at that time, such that when we get to the 25th, it's hopefully just a decision on a voting on what they'd seen throughout these numerous opportunities to interject. And then to wrap it all up, on the last governing board meeting, the policy dictates that that anything over $50,000, which for those that don't know, that's the general manager's spending authority. So he's given blanket authority by that facts and findings that any item over 50,000, he's commissioned, that's within our budget, he's commissioned to proceed with a purchase order on those. And that usually, that does occur at that meeting. And then we do a lot in our finance realm to do budget spreads, but that's on our side, and we go forward with the new year.
This is a relatively, this is a stable schedule, something that's time tested and it's worked well in the past. And are you aware of any issues that that may have happened that we need to change anything?
No, I think the crafters of the policy, and it's, you already know this, that you're going to, in a few minutes, I believe you're going to go into some of the responsibilities you hope to do, which is policy reviews. This is a policy, and I openly request any things that you guys see. From our functional standpoint, the operating budget by our methods takes about 6, and if not even 7 months of data to lay the foundation for our managers to say what are their expectations for the upcoming year. One comment I would make for ourselves is that as months continue to accumulate in the actual, meaning we have December's that would probably be presented to you in your February presentation. As we start to get further months, we're going to update the projection column. I don't think we did that a lot last year, and I think that caused a little bit of consternation in terms of like variances were getting kind of odd. So we've already addressed that internally, and we hope to improve on that.
Carl, I think you have a question.
Yes, it's been my experience too that because of the policy timetables, canceling of committee meetings due to the thought that maybe there isn't much work to do has caused issues in the past that you never know when something's coming up that you might actually need to have that committee. So if that's ever a thought, let's just discuss that as a between the committee and Pete. Because you have 2 meetings, and sometimes that early meeting is just as important as the late month meeting.
Thank you. So I asked the committee members if you have questions or comments regarding this.
No comment.
Okay, John?
Excuse me, one comment. I've watched this over 4 years, and each year it's gotten better and tighter, more formal. And I echo Carl's opinion there about canceling meetings. It's sometimes it might be a short meeting, but if you miss that meeting, you can't make it up.
Ms. Redmond?
No comment at this time.
So looking at the schedule, I see the public meetings have general manager discretion. So I'm assuming that means that the general manager can decide not to have those meetings?
Yes, but we never have in my time here.
Yeah, because I think after last year, the more transparent the process is, everybody will be happier with that. So, okay.
As I alluded, well, I'm not defending it, but we did hold it, and we welcome that intervention. There are community comments and things like that. It's published, it was taped, and I don't know the number of hits we had on YouTube, but the attendance was pretty sparse. So it's a, you know, it's not a reflection one direction or the other, maybe.
Right. I'm not criticizing the process that was held last year. I do think one of the things that I would like to see the committee do this year is simply find out if there's a better way, an enhanced way of getting public engagement. I mean, I continue to see letters to the editor in the paper that said, I had no opportunity to comment. And I'm going, that clearly is incorrect. So, you know, if we can encourage people to get engaged, that's fine. If they choose not to, well, then you can't stop them from complaining, but we can do more to try and get them engaged. Thank you.
Very well said. I echo that. It's like, we sometimes do see that and say like, that was discussed 5 times. One other comment that is not on there is for the public, by April, we have the formation of the budget starting to take, you know, interjection roots and things like that. So we do put that in the Rec Center News. And it's right there, you know, for people. It's not like they have to click on or anything. They all get that copy of that, either electronically or hard copy. And, you know, I really do believe we do everything we can to be transparent.
Mr. Bosak, do you have any comments?
No, just all it seemed that there was a disconnect between some of the meetings before the order of priority, so to speak, and I think Pete's addressed that well, and it looks like we should not have that issue come up again this year.
Okay, thank you. So at this time, I'd like to ask for consensus from the committee. Anyone object? Support? Support? Mr. Hobolt?
I'm on board.
Ann? Okay, Mr. Bosak,
Yes.
do you support it?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So
Dick, sorry. What exactly is this a consensus on?
we agree with the scheduling, with the budget timeline as proposed by Mr. Finelli. Thank you very much. We're going to go to item number 5.04, a review of the committee roles, responsibilities, and limitations. We have provided you with the handbook for the governing board for committee member handbook, and I will point out a couple points. First is that, as a point of information, the Budget and Finance Committee is one of 5 standing committees of the governing board, that we do not make recommendations. We forward a consensus to the governing board. Our responsibility is to review all aspects of the financial policies, plans, and budgets. So does anyone have need clarity on that? We are not making recommendations. We're forward to the governing board for consideration. Okay?
Dick?
Yes?
Sorry. The committees do make recommendations to the board. They do not vote,
Oh, I'm sorry.
just to clarify.
You're absolutely right about, we don't vote. We do make the recommendation. Okay. Also, I'd like to point out on page 9, committee participant roles. I won't read it to you verbatim. I'm sure you've read it. That we talk about you can only speak when you're recognized by the chairman. That we're collegial, we're professional, that we're considerate of others, and we want to hear your question and your issues. We expect you to be prepared when you come to the meeting. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that only the chairman speaks for the committee. You don't. If you're speaking to somebody and you're a member of this committee, you can talk about your personal opinion, but you can't speak for the committee, for the Budget and Finance Committee. Okay. Does anyone have questions about that? Okay. Yes, Mr.
Thank you, Dick. I do have one question. What happens if the committee does not reach a consensus?
We have 8 members on the committee. I don't vote unless there is a tie, and there won't be a tie because I won't be voting. We have 7 voting members. I do have the authority to vote, but it won't be necessary for me to vote. Okay?
Sorry, Dick.
So
I'm
we
just-
reach consensus. It doesn't say that we're unanimous. Okay?
That's right. If you don't reach 100% consensus, you reach consensus by majority. And that's how it works. Thank you.
Ann? Yes.
I might point out, as I'm a prior chair of this committee, there have been times when we did not have a consensus. I mean, we did not have a majority, or a unanimous consensus, I should say. But these, whatever recommendation or consensus or items we take to the governing board, it is incumbent then upon the chair to say B and F by a consensus of 5-2 or whatever, so that it's not perceived that it was unanimous.
Thank you for the clarification, Ann. We'll proceed to item 5.05. It would be the BNF Policy Review Plan. We have a schedule. I've assigned all of the active financial policies to individual board members, or excuse me, committee members, who and a date that that will review that particular policy. In summary, we'll start in October, the first meeting in October, and for the next 4 meetings, we'll be reviewing either 3 or 4 policies. We can make that schedule. I have made that schedule available to each member. Karen, do I provide that to? I provided that to you. Will that be part of the minutes?
It can be part of the minutes. I'm going to also include it, obviously, in each agenda.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and it will be an agenda item at each meeting. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, Ann.
Assuming that whenever I come forward with a policy that I have reviewed, if there are changes, should I not present a red line version of that to you and also to Karen in time for them to be published prior to the meeting?
Yes. Yes. I guess I hadn't. My intent of this was to have each committee member review and then start the discussion at the meeting. But if you do propose changes, that should be done in advance so we can have that advanced paperwork and we can have the discussion then.
Right, and we need to have that information in, what, a week before the meeting or 6
Ideally,
days?
if it's available, yes, but I'll take it as close to the day before. I probably shouldn't say that, but yes.
But we have to
Sooner is
publish,
better.
what, 48 hours in advance?
48 hours is the agenda posting deadline. I often have to release attachments the day before. So you can bring redline copies if you all have an idea of what you want to redline. Obviously, as Dick suggested, based on committee discussion, I will sit here and further redline for the committee. And when the committee is ready to take a consensus, I will reread any additional changes to redlining that has been provided. But if you all come with your policies and you simply want to start off with discussion and not provide a redline document, that's fine with me, because part of my role here will be to sit here and redline for the committee.
That was actually my thought, is that we would come prepared to make recommendations for change, and then we would actually make the changes at the meeting.
Okay, but if we don't have those changes to review in advance, is that something we can, by consensus, agree on that day and forward to the governing board?
We would have, we should be able to reach consensus that day and come up with the verbiage that, that we would actually then proceed to jury the committee on to come up with a consensus.
Okay, thank you.
Pete?
Excellent, Ann. I would only throw one item you didn't mention in there, and that's, generally speaking, we like to throw this to legal review before we, a legal review of some nature in there before we actually start to advance it, because it just gives a set of eyes. Is this compromising anything within the bylaws to the policies? And so I would throw that in there as well, so.
That generally occurs after committee consensus. So the
Well-
committee can go ahead, and to your point, Pete, if the attorney has an issue, then we have to do the big roundabout.
Exactly.
back
So
into
oftentimes
committees.
we try to circumvent that by saying what would be your recommended language. Your point is, though, that you have a concept change. How does that influence anything? And oftentimes there's nothing brought forward by the lawyer for grammatical, but if it involves, you know, fundamental changes, we definitely gotta get that advisement.
So in essence, if there were changes that may not go to the governing board immediately, it might be delayed for the time that it takes to get legal review.
Correct. And,
Yeah.
you know, I don't ever want to minimize anything, but these policies, they're appropriate to review in the manner that you're doing. But generally speaking, most of them, you know, have long-standing implications and not something that's, you know, going to snap judgment, going to change people's lives in overnight. It's not, I'm not saying that with absoluteness, but generally speaking, they can be done over time to make sure they're done correctly.
May I make a comment, maybe turns into a suggestion? I think grammatical errors, minor typographical errors, so forth, however many times these have been reviewed, we still seem to find the little nits. I think those are fine for somebody reviewing these to highlight, redline, but it would make sense to me to make sure that we have an open discussion on anything serious about a serious change to a policy. These policies have been in effect for many, many years. They've been reviewed over and over by a lot of very, very intelligent people and wise ones. So any change, significant change to these ought to be done carefully and in full public view. So I think some discussion, I'm trying to set expectations here. I think after some discussions, it would be appropriate to make some serious redlining, but not before serious discussion. So I see this being, if you will, approvals kind of being drug out a little bit beyond a first pass. That's just my point of view. That's all.
So we will, I guess we will come to the meeting, come to the committee meeting, and have the open discussion, and then, is that your proposal, John?
That's my proposal, and that we maybe let our experience, the first one or two sessions, kind of guide us into something more repeatable. But I think there's just something to be learned by the people on the committee before we completely lock in. So if you are flexible in that regard, I think it might be beneficial. But that's just my thoughts. Other people may have a different opinion.
we'll open it up then and ask if anyone else has any comments on this. No. David?
You know, I don't mind bringing proposed changes and submitting them ahead of time simply as a starting point for discussion. I know one thing that I've never particularly appreciated is having somebody come in and plop something in front of me and not have an opportunity to actually read it and digest it and think about it a little while. So just because somebody redlines a document doesn't mean anybody else is going to agree with the red lines. It's just a starting point for discussion. And I like to have that stuff ahead of time. It just makes it a better thought process, in my opinion.
I benefit many times from the discussion that I hear. So I don't want to preclude that before
No,
things
I
are
agree
final.
with that completely, so.
And Dick, I might add, I think it's incumbent upon every one of us on the committee to look at the documents that are going to be reviewed each meeting in advance, because we may have some input that we want to go ahead and have ready to recommendations or whatever.
Okay, those are good ideas. Thank you. So I think what we'll do is we will bring that the committee will be prepared to discuss the policy that is on the agenda, and we will make any edits that we feel necessary, and changes that we feel necessary will be done during the review process. Okay, thank you.
Dick? I have a
Gary?
question, please.
Yes,
I
Gary.
don't know if Dennis didn't have his mic on or just has a bad mic, but I didn't hear what he had to say, and I didn't only cut half of what the last conversation between you and John and Ann was. Can you just finally clarify what the expectation is for the review? I'd appreciate it.
I do. What we're planning to do is each policy that's to be reviewed will be an agenda item at the meeting, and all the committee members will be expected to have reviewed that particular policy, and then the person that's responsible will introduce it and begin the discussion. As we discuss it, they will talk about any proposed issues or questions or changes that they would like to make, and that would then be open to the committee to make to discuss and eventually come to some closure on if they want to propose a change or they don't want to propose a change. And the redlining will be done during the session of the discussion. Does that clarify for you, Gary? Gary, can you hear? We're going to assume that it does. If it doesn't, I can contact Gary and.
I'm muting and unmuting my phone, so I'm not sure that I'm getting through, but I totally agree with what you said. I think it's a very good process.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry. I hate doing these remotes, doggone it.
We're going to proceed to item 5.06. This is basically to try to synchronize our policy. The existing policy is FI 15. Excuse me, it's on the preparation of the annual financial plan. The current verbiage is the governing board shall vote on the proposed financial plan in the regular board meeting in May. Okay, and the revised is that the governing board shall vote on the proposed financial plan prior to the last day of May. Okay. This is I believe that it's to try to synchronize with our bylaws. So there is a conflict there, and this clarifies it. Is there any discussion?
person,
Okay.
and oh, I'm sorry. Being a new person on the committee, and I don't see how this is changing anything. Oh. Okay, being a new member on the committee, when I read this, I'm probably missing some additional information, because to me, I don't see the difference in this. I mean, if they're gonna vote, they would probably be doing it at their board meeting, unless they're gonna hold a special meeting afterwards? Is that what this is saying?
Technically, they could. This is to make sure that it does not go, this is to validate that we do not, that we absolutely have the meeting prior to the last of May, instead of voting on the first or the second of the part of the month. So.
Thank you.
With the addition that voting can occur at a special meeting. So we don't want to get hung up on the language that simply says that it has to be at a regular board meeting. So it's easier just to take it out, because to your point, you were absolutely correct. Voting occurs at a board meeting. Thank you.
Thank you for the clarification from both of you.
Do we have any discussion, other discussion on this? Okay, if not, I'm going to ask for concession or for consensus. Okay.
Yes.
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 Gary, can you hear?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Let the record show we have unanimous consensus.
So Dick, there we go.
It will read, the governing board shall vote on the proposed financial plan prior to the last day of May. We'll strike at the regular board meeting in May. Okay. That concludes all of our agenda items. I'm going to ask the committee for comments.
None.
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 I think it was being a new person, I think this was a very informative meeting in terms of getting oriented not only to the committee itself, but also developing an appreciation of what our staff have to go through in preparing these forms. It was just a beautiful presentation, and you all made it very easy to understand some background behind what goes into the development of these numbers and the presentation of the numbers. And I'd like to thank all of you for that.
Dr. Miller?
None.
Mr. Brosak?
Another great job by Pete and Cliff. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Now I'd like to ask if we have any comments from anyone in our audience. If you'd go to the podium and write your rec number and your name on there and identify yourself, please.
Debbie Dorn, 137872. I just I'm not a golfer. I belong to the Rip and Sew Club around the corner, and I've been through the process of asking for our room to be remodeled, and it's almost done. And I just came here to thank the Finance Committee for for voting for us to get our room remodeled. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Kevin Brooker. My member number is 132101. I was here the other day speaking. I'm a financial advisor by trade. I just had so much fun, I had to come back again and say hello to everybody. So one thing I would like to say is I'm shocked when I paid my member dues that I didn't have to pay the fee for the credit card. And we're paying, the community's paying like over $9 grand a month for credit card fees. I think should just be changed and pass it to the member, have them mail a check. More importantly, I wanted to talk about the allocation of the reserve fund. We've been talking about how important it is to the community. I think it's, in my opinion, it's obvious there was a big mistake made a year ago when the reserve fund loaded up on bonds. Those bond funds, as I calculate, are at least a $5 million loss at this point. Today's inflation numbers sent the bond market yields up again, so prices went down again, and the 2-year treasury is at a 14-year low. So that's about another 4% loss in the last 30 days. And my point is that there's a distinction to be made between aggregate bond funds, which anybody with a stock quote can look it up, type up AGG. That's the iShares Aggregate Bond Fund. You can see what it's done. There's a big difference between an aggregate bond fund and an individual bond. And I think what we should be doing, what I would like to see is we pay Mr. Finelli and his department, give them a raise, and have them just go directly to treasurydirect.gov and buy 6-month, 1-year, and 2-year treasury bills. They're all over 3%. They're all guaranteed. There's no risk of a loss. But with a bond fund, it works differently. And so now we have a 90% allocation to bonds, and we're at a long-term, high for the bond market. It's been in a 40-year bull market. So in my opinion, that's going to continue to lose money. The Fed's going to raise rates again next week, probably a few more times to fight inflation. And so I think the bond allocation is going to wind up costing the reserve fund money. And a $5 million loss, if there's 25,000 members, approximately, that works out to, what, $200 a member? So then if we didn't have that loss, maybe we wouldn't have to talk about raising member dues, right? If we're raising member dues $20 and we lost 200 because of a bad decision. So my time is up. I just want to make those comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions or comments? I think on closing, what I would like to say, I want to thank all of you for being here, everyone in the audience here in the lecture hall, and all of our listeners out in that have dialed in or watching us. I appreciate that. As Dr. Miller said, we are very, very interested in transparency. We want you to know. We want you to hear the arguments. We want you to hear the compelling justifications. Next, in October, we will have, which will, I believe, will be an another extremely interesting presentation from Cap Trust regarding our investments. And I think that's something that another piece of the puzzle we should all listen to. So at that, I want to close. Thank you very much, and the meeting is adjourned.